Hi everyone, it's Austin in the Middle, and I want to welcome you all to my channel. You might recognize me as Goosebumps Completionist and Horror Free For All. And if you're not subbed to me on those channels, I'll drop the link down in the description of this video. Now, taking from my name, you might be guessing, also by the title of this video, we're here to talk about Malcolm in the Middle, right? This is the video I wanted to start off with because Malcolm in the Middle, for all intents and purposes, I think, in my opinion, is my favorite sitcom of all time. I like it more than The Office, and that might be a hot take, but that's just me. And I think part of my love stems from my childhood. When I first got introduced to this show, I watched it from the pilot all the way through to the finale of season 7, which was the final season. And they never made a box set, unfortunately, so I never had a physical release growing up. I think I maybe had season 1 and a couple of the screener DVDs and VHS tapes that were given for like Emmy promotions and stuff. But once I got Netflix on streaming years ago and I saw it on Netflix, I watched it like 3 or 4 times over before Netflix took it off, and since then it's been on Hulu pretty consistently. And I don't think that'll ever go away as long as Hulu's around. And I've seen it on Hulu all the way through with the ads about 5 times. So my dedication and love to this show is deeply rooted. I know a lot of senseless trivia about this show that I care to know sometimes. I've been active on the Reddit boards, community fan pages, you name it, over the years. I can't get enough of this show. I even have all the ancillary books. There's like 5 books that have exclusive stories to them in there as well that I plan on covering here eventually. But why am I getting so sidetracked? I think the introduction kind of, it feels forced to put in here, but since it's my first video, I have to insert it. I'm sorry, you all. But let's get to why you came here. We're going to be talking about the top 5 worst Malcolm in the Middle episodes. Now, given that I've seen each episode at least 10 times or more, I think my list is pretty refined. Now, some of my least favorite episodes of the show might be some episodes you like. And I totally respect that if you disagree with my opinions. Opinions are subjective, right? You don't have to agree. If you want to tell me what 5 you think are the worst, or what is the absolute worst, whatever you want to leave, you can leave that in the comment section, as long as you keep it respectful and don't go too overboard with hate or whatnot. I'm usually okay with it. So, yeah, let me know what you guys think before we get into my bottom 5, okay? So, let's start off the list. Why not start with number 5? I feel like this might be a good icebreaker episode to kind of throw out there. It comes from season 7, the final season. It's episode 15 and is called AA. Now, I know a lot of you probably enjoy this episode. I'm not saying you can't enjoy AA. I just want to say why I dislike it from the core, right? The main reason why I do not like AA is because it's a finale episode of a character. Kind of like a send-off episode that we got a couple of times in season 7. But this send-off episode goes to a character that we've known since season 1. He was a core cast member, and the way they did him here was so dirty. And that character is Francis, Malcolm's older brother. What I can't stand about this episode, really, comes down to this. In season 6, in this episode called No Motorcycles, Francis reveals to Hal that he has been 6 months sober from alcohol. And he's a recovering alcoholic, right? And we don't really hear much about this update from Francis until this episode a season later. And the update we got is just really dumb. So essentially, Francis has invited his parents to this 1-year sobriety party that he's had at his AA, I forget what they call them, like convene or whatever, where they get together and talk about their addictions and stuff. And he has an apartment with his wife, Piama. They, at this point of the show, they had left Otto's Dude Ranch and got an apartment, kind of run down, but, you know, the show was going this whole route that Francis was becoming a burnout and kind of looking for his next big break. Well, Lois and Hal leaves Malcolm and the boys behind, and they go to Francis, right? But Francis seems to have his stuff together. He seems to be calm and collected. But when you get down to the point of the sobriety celebration, right, and you learn that he's been sharing all these stories about Lois over the years and how awful she was, he pretty much scolds his mom in public. And when Lois confronts him about it afterwards, he reveals that he was never an alcoholic to begin with. And he didn't know what alcoholism means, really. He just figured that if he had a bunch of life problems or some issues that could be blamed on something else, you can be considered an alcoholic, right? And I think, to me, that makes Francis's journey as a character that we've gotten to know from season 1 all the way to this point, even though he was only in a handful of episodes from season 6 and 7, unfortunately. It just feels really forced and dumb. And I hate the way this show ends his character in this episode. It looks bad on him and his whole legacy, because throughout the whole show there's this running gag that he blames Lois for all the things bad in his life, or he'll blame other people to where he never looks like he does anything wrong, right? And it's no different in this episode. The running gag continues, but in a send-off episode for such a key character that got the shaft in the final 2 seasons, you would hope that there would be more care and treatment there, but it just doesn't work for me. I just think that the execution of this episode is very poor. It's not really funny either. The only times I kind of chuckled were during the Malcolm, Dewey, and Reese bits where they're left at home. Now, that in itself is mostly filler, so like they pretty much get the house to themselves, and Hal left a set of car keys behind, so Malcolm and Reese decide to go on this huge joyride around the neighborhood getting revenge on their enemies, and they map out this whole plan. And Dewey gets involved some way. He finds out about this and decides to play a prank on him by presumably swallowing the car key. And the only way the kids can get it from Dewey is by force-feeding him some stuff that'll make him crap. And before that, they didn't know that he swallowed it, so he made them do good deeds for Dewey all day. And Dewey was getting some enjoyment out of it, but, you know, the boys figured it out, and nothing came of what the whole side plot was setting up. It was just really uneventful there as well. So, but I did chuckle at the force-feeding scene and stuff, but that's not really enough to carry this episode. Even the cold open, it's just stuff we've seen before, and nothing about this episode really matters to me. And the stuff that does matter, or should matter to the whole context of the show, in my opinion, doesn't really fit the show. I think it's more non-canon, if you ask me. This is one of the episodes I view as non-canon, and I usually try to skip this one if I'm doing a watch-through these days, just because I just don't like it. I used to not be that harsh on it when I watched it years ago, but nowadays I don't think it fits, I don't like it, and I just go cut to the finale to get an update on Francis. So, yeah. Now, my number 4 might be another hot take, because a lot of people don't like to put season 1 episodes in the worst. But I'm not afraid to put this one here. I think this is another one of those cases where I consider this episode non-canon. And it's so early on in the show, I can kind of see myself wanting to forgive a couple of things because they were treading the waters to see what stuck with certain characters. But this episode, compared to the rest of the show, just feels out of place. And you'll get what I'm saying about this. And it's Season 1, Episode 4, Shame. Now, this is the infamous episode where Malcolm beats up a 7-year-old named Kevin. Now, if you haven't seen this episode before, Kevin is easily one of the most annoying one-time characters you'll ever see in the show. And he comes off like a bully, but he doesn't like it when people bully him. He's that kind of person, you know, the people we don't like in this world. And Malcolm pretty much gives him what's deserved. But he didn't know that Kevin was 7, right? So the clinic lady ends up scolding him, and he goes home feeling ashamed, and he tells his parents, and his parents just laugh. They laugh at him and don't punish him, which is so unorthodox for this show. And that's why I have an issue with it. On top of the fillerness to the rest of the episode. But we'll get into that in just a minute. But the act of Lois, right? Lois is the hard one of the parents in this show. If you don't know, Hal is the lovable idiot. He's the yes man to Lois. And you gotta love him. You know, he has his stern moments, but he's not the parent you take serious. Lois is the one you're supposed to take serious. Now, the problem with her character is that even though she does act out of line in some episodes throughout the show, like the infamous Christmas episode where she just loses her shit and gets in a fight with a middle-class Karen in a parking lot. There's also the time in the final season where a bunch of girls humiliate Reese, and she decides to get revenge on the girls by playing some really mean pranks on them. And then there's the infamous Malcolm's Job episode, where Malcolm catches her smoking after in season 1, I think one of the first episodes, if not the pilot, she talks about quitting smoking and how miserable it was to quit. And we see her smoking at the Lucky Aid, and Malcolm catches her, and she makes a deal with Malcolm and goes back on her word, making her look like a hypocrite for all these episodes she's telling the boys to be honest, right? But this is the most ludicrous thing I think Lois has done in the whole show that feels the most out of character, because throughout the show, you see Lois grounding the boys, especially Malcolm, for doing some really asinine stuff. The prime example is the episode called Evacuation, right? Where Malcolm gets grounded because he was doing homework and didn't come home to help move a couch. And he was grounded for 2 weeks, and Lois carried his grounding over into the gymnasium after they had to evacuate their neighborhood because of a toxic chemical spill. And that, to me, feels more canon than this, where Malcolm legit beats up a 7-year-old at school. Hurts him, right? I don't think he got suspended or anything, but his mom didn't ground him or punish him whatsoever. It just seems out of character that she would just laugh at him, right? And the whole episode is played up, especially by the end, that he's supposed to identify with his conscience, and the embarrassment of him beating up a 7-year-old and the guilt from that is his punishment enough. And that just doesn't feel like the show to me. The show doesn't offer messages like that. Now, some people might like that because it's actually telling, you know, the audience that, hey, kids, it's normal to have a conscience. But if you look at all the deep meaning stuff that we got from season 1 and season 2, especially with, like, the episodes I can think of, like Lois's birthday from season 2, right? Where the boys kind of learn to respect their mom and how they just did their mom so dirty, and they learn true guilt there, right? But here, Lois isn't bending the rules to benefit herself. I mean, she's always 99.9% on top of the boys and always getting them in trouble for every little bad thing they do. And this just does not feel like Lois. Like, this is not canon to me. And aside from that, the canon problems I have in my head with this episode, the rest of it's just really forced. Like, Malcolm goes on this whole guilt trip, right? And he finds in his Krellboyne class a poster flyer for a charity run that you need, like, pledges to get to, like, endorse you and sponsor you, essentially, so when you do this race and you finish it, they pay the money to charity, wherever the charity is. And the charity's for, like, children illnesses and whatnot, but that's not really important. But the whole plot is him like training himself to run this thing, gathering pledges, and he ends up gathering all these pledges. But he ends up fumbling at the beginning of the race and not even participating. He injures himself, right? And I guess that's supposed to be like a metaphorical irony to it all, but it's not funny. None of it's funny. And then you go to the side plot with Hal is just really dumb. But, you know, to be expected, right? I think this is one of the first episodes that they're experimenting with this character. Like, he gets a wood chipper to demolish his tree in the front yard that Dewey injured himself on. But after removing the tree and having fun with Dewey and Reese with the wood chipper and destroying stuff, the neighbors start to complain that the eyesore of their lawn is becoming a problem. So Hal decides to plant a new tree to appease his neighbors. But the kicker is, Kevin's older brother, who's like 15 and Hal doesn't know it, tries to push Hal around, and Hal ends up beating the kid up and then bragging about it to Lois at the end. So you have Hal beating up a teenager and not getting in trouble for it. It sends a mixed message, right? Where's Hal's guilty conscience in all this? It's not really played up symmetrically well there. And then the whole Francis subplot might be the best part of the whole episode, to even say that, but even then that's mostly filler. It's just Commandant Spangler talking about sex ed, and Francis is trying to pull a prank on him, but the prank backfires on him, and Spangler teaches him a lesson, which also Spangler kind of acts out of character in this episode for the most part, at least for these first few episodes. Normally he would just be on Francis like white on rice, but here he just ones up Francis and just jokes about it with him. He's like, I gotcha, we're even. Very weird. It's an experimental episode. I don't really find it funny. I don't even find myself chuckling all that much, minus in the Francis bits. Very skippable. Pretty much a filler episode to the core. Alright, the next episode is a Season 3 episode. I think it's episode 19. This is an infamous one. A lot of people hate it, but I'll talk about it. Let's talk about Clip Show. Now, Clip Show is easily the laziest episode of the entire series. I have nothing of positivity to say about it, other than I do like some added context it adds to some cold opens of previous episodes up to this point, because essentially what this episode is a brief situation of the boys getting caught by Hal taking a joyride in their car, right? And Francis is involved, and that's how the cold open of this episode starts. So Hal takes it upon himself to send the boys to get therapy because they have just gone too far at this point. And all three boys, Dewey, Malcolm, and Reese, are talking to this therapist, and they're going over past scenes of the show, but they're all just cold open scenes that don't really matter to the overall story of the show. And that's frustrating, in my opinion. I think Clip Show 2 did it a bit better because I think, to my knowledge, from my memory, I could be wrong, but I think Clip Show 2 actually pulled clips from actual episode segments, not just the cold opens, like this one did. And none of it really matters to the overall coherency of the show in a whole. Other than it does add, like I said, it does add some context to some cold opens. But even then, I think this episode, what it's trying to do is revisit some funny cold opens and try to give backstory on how those things happened. Which I think is good on paper, but the whole problem with this, and this is kind of similar to an issue of a film that's very infamous in the meme community. It's called Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2, from the infamous, blacklisted film franchise that got banned in the early 80s and they went straight to video. That movie, about half of the movie is a clip show from the previous movie with no additional footage. That's what this episode is, right? It's not necessarily the worst thing ever. I think I have 2 episodes below this for a reason. I do like some of the cold opens as is. They're still funny. But I really get no enjoyment just sitting down and watching this. There's no point into it unless you really care about wanting to learn a few non-important things that involve some of your favorite cold opens. And I think they did manage to pull some decent ones there to share in the memories of these boys, but it's just pure, utter filler. It could be chopped out of the show and nobody will ever know it was gone. And that's pretty much the criteria for my bottom 5 in a nutshell. All of these episodes, you can really say the same thing about this episode for all these other ones. You can cut them out and nobody would miss them, in my opinion. Now, number 2, I've hated this episode since I was a kid. I remember the moment I watched this episode when I was a kid. I didn't think of this about shame early on until years later, but I can remember I watched this episode and I was like, man, that was a dud. What were they trying to do with this episode? And it's season 2, episode 23, and it's called Carnival. Carnival, the infamous episode where Malcolm, Reese, and Stevie try to come up with a plan to essentially say that they're going to sleep at each other's houses. Like Malcolm and Reese is going to sleep over at Stevie's house, and Stevie's going to sleep over at Malcolm's house, but they're going to go sneak off and go to the carnival instead. Now, one thing I can give a compliment to this episode is the cold open. The cold open is the infamous one where the boys go into the parents' bedroom and adjust Hal's alarm clock, and he wakes up thinking he's late for work, and he rushes through and accidentally shaves his teeth in the shower. It's one of the best cold opens, and I'll give that episode that. But other than that, this episode is one huge calculated misstep, in my opinion. Everything that should work about this episode doesn't. Right? And I think a lot of what this episode suffers from is its pace. If you ask me, this should have been a 2-part episode. And you'll see, if you've seen the episode, you kind of might understand where I'm coming from with this. Everything about this episode, not saying that Malcolm in the Middle doesn't have this problem with certain episodes here and there, but there's so many time skips here that you don't really feel like you get the full story. You only get segments of it, and you feel like there's more that you should know, right? But aside from that, it's not even funny. I think all the jokes in here aren't funny, down to the premise where, you know, Kitty and Abe, Stevie Carnarvon's parents, have never let Stevie stay over at another person's house. So, of course, that should be funny, because they're overbearing parents. You learned this in season 1, and it carries over to season 2 when Malcolm and Stevie have by this point become best friends. And they're so protective of Stevie that they want to go check on him, right? But Hal and Lois are just doing their typical thing. They got the whole night out because the boys had convinced the parents that they were going to go over to Stevie's, but Dewey had to tag along because Dewey eavesdropped on Reese and Malcolm and figured out the plan. And to avoid the plan from going south, they allowed Dewey to tag along. So they managed to all get out of the house, so Lois and Hal had the whole house in themselves. And it's a whole weird, they're lighting candles in the living room, about to make love type of thing. And it's not, that stuff is just kind of cringe. It's only funny in certain episodes, but here it's definitely not that funny. And I think when Abe comes over to check on Stevie and the parents connect the dots that the boys aren't together, that should create some situational irony to make it funny. But it just falls flat, and they end up going on this road trip thing looking for Stevie. And Kitty, she might be the saving grace of this episode. She's kind of funny, shouting his name out. And there's this one funny line bit where they bring up a sale at a adult video store because Francis is in contact with his parents because he's bored. Literally, that's the Francis storyline of the episode. He's just bored calling his parents on a Saturday night. And he tells them that there's like a sale going on at an adult video store in the carnival. And Abe pretends to turn around to the to the video store before he has to turn back around and go back to the carnival. And I thought that was kind of funny. But even when we see the bits at the carnival with the boys, everything has been fast forwarded through. Like they talk about a bus that we didn't get to see because Dewey had to stop and pee, and there's only 15 minutes left. We only see one ride of the whole carnival. It's not really expansive. All of Reese's jokes at the carnival don't land. They're not funny. And it just feels like it's just speeding through story, especially when we get to the Stevie part when he gets abducted by this security guard that takes his job a little too seriously. The security guard isn't funny, even though some of the quips that Stevie throws at him are kind of hilarious in some ways. Those jokes don't really carry the monotony of what's going on. And of course, Dewey, being Dewey around this time, he always gets into some weird shenanigans and he befriends a bunch of carnival freaks. And the whole thing involving them are just for shock value. And that kind of plays into the end. And there's a big time skip involving that. Not really funny. Don't really know what's going on. Literally, it's just so chopped and put together that it baffles me. This should have been a part 1 and part 2. You should have part 1 being the boys coming up with this plan and heading to the carnival, and they start riding some rides, but they get into some trouble. Part 2 picks up. Abe and Kitty come to Malcolm's house to check on Stevie. The parents put it together. They look for him. The boys spend the whole episode of part 2 befriending the freaks and trying to rescue Stevie, maybe with some failed attempts, and boom, context is filled. Probably more opportunity to put some more jokes in because you're not time constrained on just making a 22, 23 minute episode. And it probably would have been better that way. I mean, we had 2-parter episodes throughout the whole show. Company Picnic was one. Technically, the season 1 finale and season 2's opener with Water Park and Traffic Jam counts as a 2-parter. There was Reese Joins the Army. You know, why couldn't we have Carnival a 2-parter? Makes no sense to me. But yeah, this one, it's not really non-canon material, but it's definitely skippable. It's not entertaining. It's very close to being bad. I don't really have much fun with it. It is what it is. But my number 1 episode that I think is the absolute worst of the entire show comes from the worst run of episodes of the entire series. And I'll stand on that hill until I die. And I'm referring to season 6, episodes 1 through 5. And the 5th episode is the absolute worst episode in the whole show. And that episode is called Kitty's Back. Now, Kitty's Back, in case you haven't seen the series before, you might not be too familiar on what happened a couple seasons prior, of course. But what happened a couple seasons prior was Abe and Kitty, that I've already mentioned in the Carnival episode, who are Stevie's parents, had split up because Stevie's mom, Kitty, pretty much abandoned the family. She just up and left Abe and Stevie by themselves, and Stevie went through a heartbreaking episode, and there was a bunch of other episodes that kind of played into that we really got to see more of Abe and got to learn a lot more about his character and fell in love with him and got to see him try to forget Kitty. And Stevie, it took him a while to heal, but he had some fun episodes here and there. But this episode detracts all of that, and I think, for me, completely destroys Abe's character in the whole show. This makes me, from here on out in the show, not like Abe's character. Makes me disrespect him as a human and as a person, and as a friend to Hal and Lois, who pretty much acted like his best friends when he was going through this hard time. Now, Kitty comes back, and Abe starts to blame Hal and Lois for some harsh comments that were made about her, and how Abe is trying to stay to her defense, even though she's been gone for the past 2 years. And Hal and Lois are trying to tell him that, we were there for you and all that. Why are you treating us so badly? And Abe's like, well, she's back now. Lord knows I need a wife. Blah, blah, blah. And that alone, that carries through this whole episode, where he just sticks to the side of Kitty after she's been gone for 2 years and after he's moved on, just ruins his character. He's no longer funny in any episode. I think that hostility is still there. He does have some funny moments in some later season 6 and of course season 7 episodes, but Abe's character just never really got the respect after this for me. And I think part of the problem is the subsidiary plot involved around this has Stevie finally, I don't know how to put this. Stevie is finally excited that his mom's come home, and he wants to do perfect at this award ceremony that he's going to, and he asks Malcolm to help him, lip sync a speech because he doesn't want to mess up, and he's afraid that if he messes up, his mom's going to leave him again, right? And Malcolm begrudgingly agrees, but kind of reminds him that, hey, look, your mom abandoned you. You don't really have to try to impress her all that much. And Stevie gets upset, but Malcolm, being a good friend, does what Stevie wants. And the whole Reese subplot involved with this is that Reese gets a big old suntan and is trying to do a full body peel the whole episode. And it's absolutely disgusting. And what ends up happening is that Reese gets angry at Malcolm and Stevie for trying to kick him out and not trying to help him peel his skin. So he tampers with Stevie's recording that Malcolm made for him. And we see it near the end of the episode where his speech gets botched. And Hal's drunk and Lois and Kitty are being passive aggressive and Abe's not really being friendly. But yeah, it's not really funny at all. It's very forced and kind of hard to watch. And this episode weirdly has Francis coming home to visit too, to initiate Dewey into brotherhood, and he really just comes home to bully Dewey the whole episode. And what ends up happening is that Francis feels bad and gives him a cop-out that gets used in the later portion of the episode, which I thought was kind of clever, but not all that way smart or anything. It just feels kind of run-of-the-mill and feels kind of forced in there, like, why is Francis here? Oh, we need a babysitter for Dewey. That's what it feels like. And yeah, this is another one of those non-canon episodes in my opinion. I think this is the final one of them. I just don't think that this episode ever needed to exist, period. It's just poorly written. I mean, down to the punchline of the episode, it's not really all that funny. The subject matter, how it detracts from lovable characters really pisses me off. And nothing here really feels all that fleshed out, especially how Kitty comes back is never really expounded on, and I don't think we ever get an episode after this to ever build on Kitty's character ever again. I think she leaves the show again in some fashion. I could be wrong, but I don't remember seeing her in any other significant episode after this. It just feels like a complete waste of time to get invested into. It's just bad taste. I don't even like the directing of this episode. For some reason, this episode feels weirdly toned in color. I don't know what it is about it. I think this might be the worst directed episode too. So it's not just the writing and the bad direction and the creative, it's the look of it too. It's just unappealing to me. And I hate it. I pretty much hate this episode. This is the only bad episode in my opinion. Like, I just hate everything about it. Everything that makes Malcolm in the Middle funny to me and everything that makes it relatable and charming and rewatchable is not reflected in this episode whatsoever. And it's pretty much the only true lemon in the bunch, but these other four behind it are also worthy mentioning here. So yeah, those are the top 5 worst Malcolm in the Middle episodes. Like I said before, if you think some other episodes are worth mentioning, feel free to put them down in the comment section. If you disagree with one of my opinions, that's fine. Taste is subjective. Let me know what your thoughts are about these episodes. Do you like them? Do you not like them? Do you agree? Do you not agree? I want to know. And I can't wait to talk more about this show later on and some other projects. Please subscribe if you like the video. That would be greatly appreciated. And I can't wait to discuss more nostalgic nerd things with you all. I'll see you next time.